Hello, welcome to Clerk of Session Training Webinar Take 2 from the Presbytery of the Cascades. To those who were on a couple of weeks ago, or was it 3 weeks ago? I don't remember. It was an event to be forgotten, but this time it looks like we're doing well. There's a bit of a delay. I have about a 10 to 15 second delay. I don't know if I'm recording. I hope we're still on. It looks like, are we on? I can't tell. Well, I'm going to continue on. I tested this earlier today. It was working just great. So I'm going to assume we're still doing this. So, a little bit about the Clerk of Session training. I don't intend to cover every topic that a Clerk of Session would want. I want this to be an introductory training that provides you with the things you need right now at the beginning of the year. We're already in the near the end of the first quarter of the year, so beginning of the year maybe is a loose term. But really, there are things that happen towards the end of the year and early on in the year that those deadlines are passed, and I intend to cover those later in the year so as to not overwhelm everyone with the work. Being the Clerk of Session at first can seem quite overwhelming. I think there's a rhythm to it. You start to understand the logic to it. You start to understand the best way to keep your records in an order that you can understand so that you can do it efficiently. It does take some time. I can't, deny that, but it really is something that is doable, achievable, and it's very important for congregations and the presbytery that you do the work well. So I appreciate the fact that you're watching this video. I assume by watching this video, you're either doing the work or planning on doing the work soon. So let's talk a little bit about Clerk of Session work. First, let's look at some of the things that are resources for clerk. Now, one of the resources for the clerk is the stated clerk of the presbytery and those who work in the presbytery office. We can help you. If you have questions, don't hesitate to call me. My number is available on the presbytery website. But there are other resources you can look at as well. And these resources you'll discover may not be as helpful to you at first as you'd hope. So please call. If it doesn't make sense, please call. I'll show you kind of where to find things in the various resources I'm presenting here. And after a while, you'll understand, you'll get some of the logic and where to look. So one place to look is in the Book of Order. Now, the Book of Order is a document that you'd think as a clerk would be very helpful, and it is, because it has a lot of information about what a congregation needs to do in order to do things decently and in order. It talks about who has responsibility for what, who doesn't have responsibility for what, and those are important things. But I'll talk a little bit later about things, questions people often ask. They say, I can't find in the Book of Order something about an executive session when the session is going into executive session. Where's that in the Book of Order? Well, not everything is in the Book of Order, but it does provide an overall framework for our work. Another item that I would be remiss not to mention is the Book of Confessions, and this is also a resource that provides an overall framework for what we do and why we do it. The fact that we are a part of the church and that the church is called by God and called by Jesus to participate in God's mission in the world. We find that sort of information, the things that have identified us historically as Presbyterians, our beliefs, in the Book of Confessions. Another item, I don't have one here, is a church manual of operations. That's a big word, and often people will say, I don't have a church manual of operations. And you may not have a complete manual of operations, but there are certain things that you will have in that comprise your manual of operations. All churches have bylaws. You may not know where your bylaws are. It would be a good idea to start looking for the bylaws. You don't use your bylaws every day. You don't use them every week. But when you do need the bylaws, it's usually a very important reason why you need them. So to have them handy so that when there's a meeting and someone says, do our bylaws allow this? Or how many elders are supposed to be on session? Or why do we say that? What's the quorum for a congregational meeting? All of those things, you'll find those in your bylaws. So look for those. In fact, I heard of a congregation that the county was asking them to see a copy or their articles of incorporation and their bylaws in order to show the purpose, the intent of their organization, the fact that they were indeed truly a church. I believe the issue is one of taxation. And so just so you know, things like when you get a letter from your county, it pays, don't throw that in the trash, because counties are starting to look at churches and make sure that they really are churches. Even though you're a tax-exempt organization, according to the IRS, that's just for federal taxes, not for county or property taxes. So you often have to apply for property tax exemption with your county. And we've had several churches that have let that lapse. Some counties, every county is different. They say, please fill out a form every year, every 5 years, or every 3 years. And when it lapses and they send you a bill, then you have to appeal. The bill is hefty, so it's good to just be on top of that. You might want to, this is just a throwaway tip, not a throwaway, is to check with your the municipal tax authorities and make sure that you are fully compliant and how long you'll be compliant so you can stay ahead of that. A church just received a $20,000 bill for property taxes that they didn't pay last year because they failed to file an appropriate form. It somehow slipped their mind. Well, that's a $20,000 mistake. They're going to have to appeal it. Hopefully, not always, counties like their money. They'll hopefully get that entire amount waived, but I don't think it's going to be as simple as writing one letter. It's going to take some extra effort. So stay ahead of that. But I just brought that up because bylaws and your articles of incorporation, if you don't know where those are, look for those. Could be good to have on hand. Articles of incorporation, not on the slide, but I'm adding that because we're in real time and I'm learning things every day. The standing rules are another document that are subservient to your bylaws. Most congregations, I guess, don't have standing rules. You might. They tend to be of an administrative character. They're more easily overturned than bylaws. But the thing about standing rules is they would be for the congregational meetings. Congregational meetings don't tend to happen very often. And in Presbyterian polity, while congregational meetings are able to take care of very important decisions in the church, such as the terms of call and calling pastors and property issues, most of the things that congregations do happen through the sessions. So standing rules are not often found, but if you have them, you know what they are. Those would be in your manual of operations, or maybe they'd be separate from your bylaws in another file, but you probably ought to put those types of things together. There are other manuals that would go into a manual of operations for various committees and various procedures. For instance, there could be a procedure for counting the offering. It would be a financial procedure that would have controls on how the offering is counted. There may be a manual of operations that's for the worship committee or the worship team or whatever you name that explains, who knows, the types of tape or ways of affixing things in your sanctuary, who's responsible for what things, how communion's done, a manual of operations for the deacons and other things. Now, my sense is that a lot of churches, and if you're a stated clerk and you say to yourself, oh wow, I don't think our church has any of that, I'm already way behind. Well, you're not. It's not necessarily your responsibility to write all of these things, but you can gently remind the session that these are tasks that need to occur. These are items that we need to have to efficiently run our church. Some are more complicated than others. It depends on the size of your church, the emphasis, and so on. So that's another part of the manual of operations. Now, not in your manual of operations directly, but part of the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church USA. I was trying to avoid acronyms, but we'll use USA. I think everyone knows it. But if you looked in the Book of Order, it says that for session meetings, because a session is a council of the church, Robert's Rules of Order is the parliamentary authority. So this is Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, and you can see perhaps that it's a very thick book, over 700 pages of parliamentary nuggets that you'd love to learn. It can be a little inaccessible at times, but for instance, if you need to know where to find information about going into executive session and how to take minutes for executive session and how to go into and out of executive session, this is the book you'd want to look in. Now, hopefully the moderator of your session, that's usually the pastor or someone appointed by Presbytery to moderate the session, hopefully they are well versed enough in Robert's Rules of Order that they can run the meeting. But as this clerk, they often ask you questions, and it's just good to have a second set of eyes and ears thinking about parliamentary procedure. So over time, you'll learn more of it. I think I note on my slide that this resource, Robert's Rules of Order newly revised in brief, much shorter book. How many pages? Under 200 pages, including some tables and things, can be really helpful. It will tell you a little bit about how to take minutes so that the minutes don't take you forever. It will tell you some helpful techniques for participating in a meeting. So there may be resources in here you want to look at. I don't want to spend a lot of time on parliamentary procedure, even though I love parliamentary procedure and I'm doing a lot of work to get accredited as a parliamentarian, because, and I'll say this later, most church sessions function as a small board. And because they function as a small board, Robert's Rules of Order is clear that you can use an abbreviated method of Robert's Rules of Order. So you don't have to go through all the steps of, for instance, in Robert's Rules of Order, you need to make a motion before you begin speaking most of the time. There's a few exceptions, but you can't just speak about a topic until you have a motion on the table. But in small boards, they realize that rule doesn't necessarily need to hold. You may think it does in your session, and it well may. It could be a good rule to have, but many sessions are able to function in a less structured way because it's a smaller board. It doesn't need all the formality in order to be efficient. So I just want to point that out. So sometimes people feel bad. They say, oh, our session doesn't really use Robert's Rules of Order. And often what they mean is that they're not using the full Robert's Rules of Order that you might see at, for instance, the General Assembly level, where you have, 600 commissioners, or the Presbytery level, where you have, over 100 commissioners and members trying to speak. So I'll just bring that up at this point. I need to move forward here. Where are we at next? Duties of clerks. Now, I'm not sure if you can hear me here, so I will just talk a little bit as you're looking at this. I think you can hear me. Let's see. The duties of the clerk, and one of the things I wanted to talk about, because we'll talk about the others later, are reports. A lot of what the clerk does is reports. So what I want to say here, and I'm going to switch slides just in case, I just showed you the duties of clerk slide. I'm not sure if I had audio on that. It wasn't entirely clear to me that I did, so I want to make sure that you can hear what I'm saying about the duties of clerk. And the thing I wanted to talk about was reports. And I wanted to say that there are reports that you need to transmit to the Presbytery and to the General Assembly. There's a leader assignment form that's turned in normally near the end, not near the end, near the beginning of the year, or whenever you elect new officers to your Board of Deacons and your session. The leader assignment form can be found on the Presbytery website, and anytime you have a change in leaders, you can fill this out and let us know who your leaders are. Right now the form is a little bit clunky, and I want to, hopefully we can get a form that will be online that you can fill in, and rather than asking you to list all of your leaders, it will say, here are the leaders we have. We have 6 people on session. Is this still correct? And you can say, well, we just elected a new class. We had 3 in the old class that just left, or maybe 2 of them left, 1 re-upped and is serving a 2nd consecutive term. And then you'd only have to add 2 names to that. So that's coming. Look for that. It should make the form a little more easy for you and more accessible for the presbytery. But I do encourage you to look for the leader assignment form and fill that out. Because when I say look for it, we're talking, I work for the presbytery and I have adopted the presbytery's ethos and I work at a glacial speed. So I will try to get this done ASAP, but ASAP for the clerk these days could be several months out. Another report is the necrology report, and again, you can find that on the Presbytery website. And I had a slide that did not cooperate with me that was showing where to find that on the Presbytery website. But if you go to the website and you look under resources, and under resources you go to documents and forms, and you scroll down that page until you find the section for clerks, you'll find the necrology report form. We do like the necrology report form turned in whenever it happens. Whenever it happens, if there's been a death of an elder, whether they're currently serving or not. If someone if someone transfers to your congregation and you're aware that they were an elder in another congregation, and then they pass away while part of your congregation, if you can let us know about that, that would be helpful as well. So we would know that that person died, and we could note that in our report. And we would ask you when they were an elder and where they were ordained. And often people don't know all that information, like the total amount of service and so on. You come in as a new clerk, you have no idea. You do the best you can. If all you can do is give us the date of the death and the person's name, that's wonderful, but we do like more information if possible. So when they were ordained, how long they served, if it was at a different church or different churches, maybe this person moved around and served as elder in several different congregations. That would be great for us to know. We do use that data. So do the best you can with those. And as you're collecting information, when people join the church, and often you see a letter, it says they were an elder, the other church says, oh, it's with some sadness that we agree to transfer Mrs. Sally Smith to your church. We benefited greatly from the fact that she was an elder, ordained in 1978 and served, 9 years from then, or 6 years then, and another 3 years later on, served as the treasurer, whatever else they say. Was a great Sunday school teacher. But do note some of those things that will come in handy when you fill in a necrology report down the road. There was another item there, the annual statistical and clerks reports. Those occur later in the year and early in the next year. So we're past the deadline on those. I'm going to do training on those later rather than do that now. In the past, it's been quite complicated. There were a number of reasons why the statistical and clerks report were complicated. When they went to an online version back in the dial-up days, you could get, they just didn't have the bandwidth capacity, and people would try to get on at 3 a.m. when no one else was on doing these things. So you don't have to worry about that as much anymore. You do your best. Hopefully you can complete the entire statistical report. Sometimes with the finances and things, you'll have questions. So you'll have to get information to do that. But that's all I'm going to say now. We'll talk more about that next October. So let's move on to the next topic. I wanted to talk a little bit about types of meetings. And again, if you have any questions and you can't sign in to the YouTube live chat, feel free to text me at 503-720-5392 if you have any questions. Maybe you had questions before, and you can do that as well. You can text them or send me an email later and I can answer them offline. But I'll try to do them online as well. So let's talk a little bit about types of meetings as we move forward. So one type of meeting that the clerk of session is involved with is the congregational meeting. Now, the congregational meeting is interesting in this fact that you're the clerk of session, but because you're the clerk of session, you're also the clerk of the congregation. The congregation is actually a separate entity in many ways, or in all ways, from the session. They're related to each other. So At the congregational meeting, you're the clerk, and you take minutes. If you're unavailable, the congregation elects a secretary. And where this is interesting, I think, is this. Sometimes when you show up, or sometimes you know you're going to miss a meeting as a clerk, you say, I'm not going to be at the next meeting. And people say, okay, well, so-and-so will be the clerk at the next meeting. Or maybe at the next meeting, they'll just say, oh, so-and-so, you're usually kind of the backup clerk. Would you mind taking minutes? And they say, sure. That's at a session meeting. But at a congregational meeting, it's the right of the congregation to elect. So the congregation could elect that person. And where it gets confusing is you could say, I'm not going to be at the congregational meeting, and someone on session says, well, I'll take the minutes. What you'd need to do, what I think is the best expedient way to do that is for session to elect that person as a clerk pro tem. So they would be a clerk until the next session meeting, in which case you would resume the clerk duties, and that way you wouldn't have to complicate, because I think sometimes we complicate congregational meetings when we ask for motions to do things like elect a clerk and things, when people just want somebody to take the minutes, and we want to get out of there because it's just after worship and the coffee's still hot downstairs and we haven't gotten there, or however. So I would say just to be aware of that, maybe if you're not going to be there, have the session elect a clerk pro tem, or just have someone take the minutes and acknowledge that, though technically it's the right of the congregation to elect someone unless it's the clerk of session. Book of Order G1-0503 talks about business proper to a congregational meeting. So the Book of Order is important in ways, and it gives you a list of 7 or 8 items, maybe it's 6 items, depends on how you break them up, that a congregation can do at a congregational meeting. And I can't remember if I say this here, but the minutes of a congregational meeting can be approved by the session, even though the session is another body, and a separate, political body. The reason for this is because the congregation generally meets annually. Some congregations meet twice a year, but they don't meet on a quarterly basis. And the idea is, if you don't meet within a quarter and you take the minutes of a meeting and you bring them to the next year to that meeting and ask for an approval, well, who can recollect that? So the session at the next meeting should approve at their next session meeting should approve the congregational minutes, as well as minutes of their previous meetings as a session. I hope that made sense. Now, another kind of meeting is the regular or stated meeting of the session. And this is a session meeting that happens on a regular basis. Sometimes the bylaws specify it's held monthly. Sometimes they're even more particular. It's held on the second Tuesday of the month. Maybe they're not held every month. They don't need to be. But these are meetings that you anticipate coming up. And so that's sort of the normal meeting. That's sort of the standard for session meetings. But there's also a special meeting, a special session meeting. In fact, you could have a special congregational meeting as well. It kind of works the same way. A special meeting is called for a special purpose when you can't wait for the next ordinary meeting, or when it's just not convenient to do that. Sometimes churches, when new members want to join, they call special session meetings to I almost used the word interrogate. No, to examine folks for membership. So that's fine. You call a special meeting, but you still take minutes. And the minutes of special meetings are approved at regular meetings. Okay? So you could also do a special meeting because you just had a session meeting, and 2 days later, something happens at the church. There's an issue with the roof, an issue with the furnace, and you call a meeting because someone needs authorization to take action. So, or maybe the treasurer resigns and you want to appoint a treasurer or something like that. So you say, we better have a meeting on next Sunday. We just met last week, but we better meet next Sunday after worship for a special meeting for a particular purpose, and that's what you do. As a clerk, you take minutes. The next regular or stated meeting of your session, you would submit those minutes to see if they were for approval and correction. Finally, there's another kind of meeting called the adjourned meeting. And this is an uncommon kind of meeting, but I'm just bringing it up to say that sometimes if you're meeting and let's say it's getting late at night and you want to continue that meeting, but you don't want to continue it, it's 10 o'clock at night, you've been there since 7, you're like, how did that happen? You need to finish the business. You could just say, let's deal with this at the next stated meeting. Or you could simply say, we need to continue this conversation. Let's do it in 3 days. We're going to adjourn this meeting to the next meeting. And then at that meeting, you would take up business where you left off. If that happens, I don't think that happens very often in congregations, but just so you're aware, that's another kind of meeting. When you would adjourn to that meeting. You would adjourn one meeting to that meeting, so it's still part of the meeting. In fact, that's all I'm going to say about that. I could get into all the weeds, but you don't want to know about the weeds. If you do, let me know. I'd be excited. But let's talk about some more practical things. Let's talk about, for instance, what to put in the minutes. You're at the meeting as the clerk. You're taking minutes, and so you want to know what to put in the minutes. Now, the first thing you can see, wow, that's really small on that slide, is that it says you should put actions in the minutes. And I think that's the most important thing to do. When the meeting is convened, and we put in the minutes that the meetings are convened with prayer, you say that. You say who's at the meeting. You list who's there. You can also list who's absent. You list what their function is, whether they're elders, whether they're the clerk, whether they're the moderator, whether they're guests. But then mainly what you're putting in the minutes isn't what people said. It's what was decided is an action item. So basically you're putting in the minutes motions. You do put a little bit of extra wording to perhaps something that was said that helps people later understand what the motion is, but you really want to keep it as short as possible. It is not uncommon to have a meeting where you can get your minutes on one page for a session meeting. It depends on the session. Maybe longer, but when you're writing 5 or 6 pages of minutes, it's probably too long. The art of minutes is what do I want to say? It's an art. It is an art. It takes time to understand, but or to figure out what to put in there. But here's some things to put in the minutes, since I'm running ahead of myself. First off, the kind of meeting. Is the meeting a regular meeting? Is it a special meeting, or is it an adjourned meeting? So you just say the minutes of the the date of the meeting, the name of the church, and then sessions. So Aurora Presbyterian Church session meeting. So special meeting, Aurora Presbyterian Church session, March 17th, 2017, Aurora Presbyterian Church Fellowship Hall. Persons in attendance. You say in attendance. And you can list them alphabetically or however, or say moderator, Bill Smith, clerk of session, Sally Smith, elder, Rob Smith, elder or elders, Roberta Smith, Tim Smith. Hopefully they have different last names. It's starting to sound nepotistic. But you get the idea, I think. Then you put whether the minutes of the previous meeting were read and approved or read and corrected. And the reason I point this out is you don't have to say it was a correction to the February minutes was X. Was that the potluck will be a breakfast potluck and not a brunch potluck. That was changed. You don't need to put that. Just say that the minutes were approved. Or if there were no corrections, the minutes were read and approved. Or the minutes were corrected. As read, or corrected as distributed if you didn't read the minutes. People used to read the minutes before there were ways of mimeographing or distributing minutes electronically. So now they're distributed. The minutes were approved as distributed. The minutes were approved approved as corrected. So let's see, where am I now? What else do you let's see. And I'm afraid, I think I have lost my volume here, so I'm just going to have to add that really quickly. I don't see it. Okay. Let's make sure that's right. So if you can hear me again, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Oh boy. Let's see what happens now. Okay, so you want to put as little as possible in the minutes if you didn't hear me say that before. But let's look at this again. I think I've said this before, but in the minutes, completed main motions that were voted on. So if someone brings up a motion and then they withdraw, they say, never mind, that's not, we don't need to deal with that. I forgot, we already decided that, or however that happens. You don't need to note any of that. But if the main motion is completed and voted on, you need to put in there whether it passed or failed. If it was an incomplete motion, that means that the motion was made and then maybe it was voted, someone said, this is a great motion, but let's refer that to the worship committee before we actually take action. We're going to talk about, let's go to communion every week. Well, let's talk to the worship committee and the deacons before we do that. So we're going to refer it to the worship committee to consult with the deacons before we make the decision. All right, you better put that, that needs to go in the minutes because you want to come back to it later when the worship committee brings their recommendation at the next meeting or whenever you want the recommendation made. So that would be an incomplete motion. And maybe it has secondary motions. A secondary motion means maybe that it was amended or that it was referred. The referral would be in there too. So you'd know, well, we referred this motion last time and we said we asked them to come back. What's going to happen? A notice of the motion goes in the minutes too. If someone says, this doesn't happen too often, I don't think this happens often at a session meeting, but someone could say, well, next meeting I'm going to bring a motion to do, to change the bylaws would be something that would happen at a congregational meeting, and that could happen, where they would say, here's a notice of a motion. But sometimes you have to give notice of motion, and you just say so-and-so, so-and-so made notice that they will move the following item. Secondary motions that will clarify. So main motions are motions that say that to do something usually external to the session, but a secondary motion such as to recess or suspend the rules, you could put that in there to clarify. I mean, if there's a moment in the meeting where someone says, oh, I need to go upstairs and get this handout, it's really important, I guess you could put in there we recessed, but if it's really quick, I'm not sure how important that is to do. Someone can disagree with me on that, but I think that's how I would do it. I would keep those things to a minimum because they just clutter up the minutes. As I said or alluded to earlier, meetings are opened and closed with prayer, and that's recorded along with the time the meeting was opened and closed. Now, minutes of session meetings need only be signed by the clerk or moderator. For a long time, I believe in earlier iterations of the Book of Order, they said that minutes of session needed to be signed by both. So if that's been the practice and you want to continue doing that, great. But if for some reason you want to just have the clerk sign them or the moderator sign them, that is also an acceptable practice. Congregational meeting minutes used to need both signatures, moderator and clerk. But the current Book of Order doesn't say that anymore. So that change means that only one of them needs to sign it. It's not a bad idea to have both sign it, I guess, but you can, if, for whatever reason, someone's not available to sign, you don't need to mail them across the country because you had a congregational meeting to dissolve a call and the pastor moved to Maine. You could, as the clerk, just sign those minutes once they were approved by the session. Boy, I forgot I had so much in here on what's in the minutes. Usually in the minutes, especially in a session meeting, if the motion was made by someone, you just say the name of the maker of the motion. You can just put the last name or first initial and last name. People have often put the name of the person that seconds the motion. Not necessary. If it's a custom and you want to continue that custom, great, but you don't need to. General consent is just noted. So sometimes business happens by general consent. For instance, the minutes, an appropriate way to handle the minutes is for the moderator to say, are there any corrections to the minutes? and wait. Having heard no corrections to the minutes, unless there's objection, it is ordered that the minutes are approved as distributed. No objection, so just by general consent, it was ordered, or by general consent, the minutes were approved as corrected. You also need to include if there was a counted vote. If for some reason you decided to vote maybe by ballot in a session meeting on a sensitive issue, or you wanted to, or you couldn't tell that, was it 8 against 7 or 7 against 8, which side prevailed, people raised their hands or stood up, a counted vote needs to be included in the minutes. You can include names and subjects of guest speakers, but don't try to summarize their remarks. And so that's important to know, because then it just goes on forever. Just say so-and-so came and addressed us on the topic of affordable housing in the community. And I also say here, get the basic standards for session records, and that is on our Presbytery website. And I feel like I should really do more than just say that's on the website. So hopefully I can include a document with this later when we figure out some more. We can figure out some more of the functionality with our live streaming of webinars. Then we'll have a little more functionality with it. Let's see, we got that. All right. I may be beating a dead horse here, but here's some things to leave out of the minutes. Procedural motions, amendments to motions, and reports. What I would say is procedural motions are when someone says, I call the question, or I move the previous question. You don't need to put that in the minutes. That motion is voted on. It's a very important motion, but it doesn't go in the motion. When I say amendments to motions, if the motion has been completed and voted on, you don't say, it was moved that we pay the janitor a $10 bonus for Christmas. A motion to amend was made by so-and-so to make it $20 for Christmas. Basically, if that $20 motion was carried and was approved, and so then the main motion then became, shall we give $20 to the janitor for Christmas? Then what you would put in the minutes is not all the amending. You would just simply say what the final result was of that main motion. And when I say append reports or keep the reports in another place, many committees and others bring reports to the meetings, and they don't need to be included in the body of the meeting. They could go to the, what do I want to say? You could just append them if you need to. Say the minutes of the, what's a committee at a church? Buildings and Grounds Committee, or the report of the Buildings and Grounds Committee is found as Appendix A. The report of the Christian Education Committee is Appendix B, and so on. Or just keep them in a separate place. Okay, let's talk about longevity issues, or how we store the records, the minutes. Where am I? Yes, so minutes, longevity issues. You can use the minutes books. They're the hardbound books that have a special paper in them that you can get from various church publishers. I don't think they're as easy to get as they used to be. So you don't need to use them. You could use a simple binder. Now, we've had some issues over the past probably decade or more when we've been trying to determine the best way to store records. So what we do say now is you print archival minutes on archival quality paper. So you know when you go to, I don't know, I was going to say Home Depot. That's not the place you go. You go to Office Depot maybe, and they have copy paper on sale for a cheap price. Great to use that paper. I recommend using inexpensive paper for most things. But when it comes to printing the official copy of the minutes that goes in your binder, make sure you get paper that's good for archival quality, that's going to last, that doesn't have acids or other chemicals in it that tend to degrade over time. So look for a quality paper that you use for that. And at one time, they were telling folks to use plastic sleeves. So you may look back in your minutes and find just hundreds of pages of minutes in plastic sleeves. Now they're saying don't use them. Now, actually, there's a kind of plastic sleeve you can use, but it's very expensive. It's hard to find. People were going to the dollar store and buying plastic sleeves, which are actually the worst thing you can do for minutes. They degrade the print rapidly. You'll notice you'll pull the print away and it sticks to them. The archival people say, please don't do this. You might want to start taking them out of those plastic sleeves, especially if you're not sure. If they look like really nice plastic sleeves, maybe they're the right kind. But plastic sleeves, you'll hear people say, why aren't they in plastic sleeves? And you need to say, because we no longer use plastic sleeves. That was actually a terrible idea. Pagination. Now, some people have an issue with pagination because they have these session books and they're on page 3065, and page 1 happened in 1885 or 95. You don't need to do that, especially when you go to binders. Once you close out a record book, you could say, okay, here are the minutes for January of 2017, January 15th, 2017, session minutes, and at the bottom of the page, say page 1. Maybe on the next page, say page 2 of the January 15, 2017 meeting. February, again, you go page 1 of the February minutes, page 2 of the February minutes, and so on. You could say page 1 of 2, page 2 of 2, so that it makes it harder for people to insert extra pages. Let's see, I'm running behind here. Let's find it. Okay. Another thing that comes up in the meeting, so you're taking minutes at the meeting, and some meetings have clerks reports, or I guess not some. I imagine a lot of meetings have clerks reports. So you might want to know what are some things you could put in the clerks report. I would say correspondence. Any correspondence that came to the church, you could certainly bring up at that time. I do use the adjective pertinent. And why? Because I was at a meeting where someone was listed exhaustively all the correspondence that had come in the last month. There were ads, ads for different stores, letters from people that were just sent to the church because they were interested or had a concern about a national issue and hoped the church would respond, things like that. I mean, they didn't seem necessarily pertinent to me. So you can use some judgment there and find things that, err on the side of caution, but find things that are material to the meeting. Baptisms, transfers, resignations, deaths, all of those things come through the clerk's report to the meeting. If communion was served and when sometimes comes through a clerk's report, or the worship elder reports that. If there were other actions that were taken or take place on a recurring basis, you may want to report on those as well to say that they have been completed. Well, we did talk a little bit about baptisms, transfers, resignations, and deaths, and that gets us to rolls and registers. So this is probably outside the meeting. I mean, if you have some free time in the meeting, you could work on the rolls and registers, but you certainly make some reports during the meeting, and then you need to determine what to do with this information. Someone is baptized. Their name goes on the baptized member roll, especially if they don't join the church as an active member. When we baptize infants or children, we often allow them then to join the church later as an active member, but we put them on the baptized member roll. We keep rolls of the elders. Say when someone becomes an elder, we put their name in that roll. We say the date they were ordained. We say that they were elected to a term of however many years. When someone gets elected to the next term as an elder, we put that information in there. If an elder resigns early, we note that in that register. We do the same thing for deacons. We do the same thing for pastors. Let's see. Another point, you should have membership rolls, both chronological and alphabetical, which cross-reference. So just to be clear, there will be a numerical roll where you list people in the order they became members. So the first member of the church became a member of your church probably on the day it chartered. Maybe the first 20 or 25 members or whatever the requirement was. At one point it was over 100, I think. So those names are listed numerically, but not necessarily alphabetical, because the next year someone joined and their last name started with an A and the first member of the church's name started with a T. So you have this chronological membership roll that's numerical, but then you'll have this alphabetical way to cross-reference. So you'll have an alphabetical roll, which is not entirely alphabetical, but you'll at least have people under the A's that have the name A and S under S. So it's hopefully easier to find folks there with those names. Now I'm completely lost here in my slides. What happened here? Okay, so that's what, oops. Did I do that? Let's see. Yeah, I did. Okay, I'm just going to say that. It looks like I skipped around here. It's hard to see what I'm doing, it looks like. Or maybe I'm not the brightest, sharpest clerk in the clerk file. All right, let's move on beyond roles and registers quickly, and we'll move to some useful motions in parliamentary procedure. Some things that I think are important to know. I said we wouldn't talk a lot about parliamentary procedure, but here are some things to think about. Let's talk about the treasurer's report. In many congregations, people vote to receive reports from the various committees and officers. And they often vote to receive or accept the treasurer's report. They'll say, well, I move to accept the report. And you'll see here the treasurer's report should not be accepted, and that should be a period there. So you don't accept treasurer's reports because that puts everyone on the hook legally for what's in the report. So Robert's Rule says you don't accept treasurer's reports. If it's the annual report, an appropriate motion would be to refer the report for audit or refer it for review if you have a committee that does an annual financial review. It's the reviewed or audit that is accepted. So then when the financial review committee or the CPA or whoever who's auditing your church financial report, the year-end report, when they bring a report, that's the report that you accept. That's just a really helpful thing to know. I did mention earlier about general consent, right? And so I've often heard people say at the end of the minutes, can we have a motion on the minutes? Is there a second? It can be really quickly done. It can be more quickly done if the moderator says, are there any corrections to the minutes? Maybe they get some corrections. We decide those corrections are appropriate. Are there any more? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Are there any more corrections to the minutes? Finally, we've gotten to the right place. Hearing none, the minutes are approved as distributed. There can be other ways of doing it. I think there's a motion, the moderator says, is there any objection to holding the congregational picnic on June 20th? Hearing no objection, the picnic will be held on June 20th. That's an action. That's a motion that was adopted by general consent or sometimes called unanimous consent. When you've reached the end of the agenda, you don't need to have a formal motion to adjourn. I've heard that before. We get to the end, it's like, well, there's no more business. Is there a motion to adjourn? Is there any other business is all the moderator needs to say. Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. I just want you to know that so when moderators begin to do this more often, you don't say, wait, who made the motion? General consent happens. I'd be curious to know if there are other motions or procedures you found helpful or situations where you think there's got to be a better way or a more efficient way to move forward. Let's see, how did that happen? Earlier, we talked a little bit about small board rules. Small board rules are what applies, according to Robert's Rules, for smaller groups. Deliberative bodies. So sessions can generally be viewed as small boards. Now Robert's Rules, if you were to read that, says 12 members or fewer are what make a small board. But it really has to do with how much controversy. Is there a small amount of controversy or a large amount of controversy? It's really up to the moderator to determine if it's a small board or not. There could be a board of 25 folks that can function as a small board because the nature of the business is such that there's a lot of agreement and there are a few people who speak most of the time and others, there's just a polite atmosphere, and that's fine. They could function by small board rules. At a certain point, it just becomes unwieldy because there are too many folks. But, you could have a session of 6 people who are just highly contentious, and the moderator could say, this small board is not working anymore. We're going to full Robert's Rules of Order. Anyway, so small board rules often work. There's no need to rise to speak or make motions. At a Presbytery meeting, you need to rise and address the moderator to make a motion. But you could just have someone around the table raise their hand or just at a moment say, I'd like to make a motion if they're not interrupting anyone. Motions don't require a second under small board rules or don't need to require a second. Small board rules are not like take it or leave it, you can determine which rules you're going to keep. So a lot of times people do keep the second. Or maybe they just say you don't need a second, but you don't have to rise, but you don't need a second, but you do need to rise and speak. It's kind of up to the moderator. Informal discussion is okay if there's no motion on the floor. Informal discussion is not okay if there's no motion on the floor under Robert's rules in a large meeting, but in a small board, it could be appropriate. And the moderator may speak to issues in small board rules without leaving the chair. It's not uncommon for the moderator, especially if it's the pastor who's serving in that congregation, to know a lot about a topic and want to speak about it. And they don't need to leave the chair and have someone else moderate if they're just, especially if they're not arguing for a point, but trying to provide clarity. Let's go to, next. Next is the annual review of minutes. And the annual review of minutes is something that we do in September and October of the year. What will happen is you'll get an email sometime in August, possibly September this year, that says, hey, it's time for the annual review of session minutes and records. So there will be a list of places you can go to have your minutes and records reviewed and read. And how you look for a space, and we try to do them all over the Presbytery at different times. They're not all on Thursday night. There's maybe one on Thursday night, one on a Saturday afternoon, and one on a Tuesday morning even. These are hypothetical. It's whenever we find times to do this. And you look and you say, oh, I can get my minutes read. That time works well for me. If none of the times work well for you, contact me or contact one of the associate stated clerks, and their names will be listed at that point on that piece of paper, and say those times don't work, and we'll probably be able to add another time or find a way to get your minutes read. These are great opportunities. They're not like a time to pass or fail minutes. Essentially what we do is we try to make sure that the minutes are relatively complete. And if you do that every year, if there are some deficiencies in the minutes, it's easier to rectify them than when it's 5 years ago. Often when I read other folks' minutes, I see more efficient ways I can take minutes. I also have learned about things that are going on in other congregations. I think, what a great idea. Look what someone's doing. There was a motion to start a midweek service at a pizza parlor. Who thought of that? Or I don't know. And you may have some ideas you bring back to your congregation. So again, these are wonderful opportunities to gather with others who are clerky like you and get minutes read and your registers approved, and they make sure that things that happened in the minutes when you accepted members or dismissed members are put in the appropriate rolls and registers. They just double check that. Anyway, look for an email in late August or maybe later. We're in transition this year, so you know what's going on with that. I said I wasn't going to speak about the annual statistical reports, but I did want to let you know that that's something that's coming up. They're due in early February. We don't really encourage folks to begin those until the first of the year, so we've got some time on that. And we're working on some ways that we can make that process more clear. One thing I'll say several times over the course of the year is when you're doing the statistical reports, you're not going to need session approval before you submit. You can report them afterwards. We've had issues where people have waited to get session approval to submit their statistical reports, and then they couldn't enter the statistical reports because the General Assembly at a certain point in time goes to press and prints the book. And so while, sure, it would have been nice that the reports were reviewed by session and approved, because we waited for that, we actually ended up not getting there at all. Whatever was approved was never submitted. So we'll talk more about that later. A few last minute things before we come up on the 4 o'clock hour. We have here the sexual misconduct policy. Every congregation needs to have a sexual misconduct policy. A few things about this. The Presbytery website has some samples. If you go to the Presbytery of the Cascades page, go to resources, go to documents and forms, look down to the clerk accession area. There's a link to a folder that has many examples of sexual misconduct policies from different congregations. I did this on purpose because there's no one-size-fits-all sexual misconduct policy. Each church needs its own policy crafted to its own particular situation. The size of the church, the types of programs, the type of community all play a factor. If you want someone to look over your sexual misconduct policy, the best people to do that are your insurance provider or providers. They're probably the best place to get expert advice, and they have a stake in your sexual misconduct policy. So they can tell you if it's current and up to date and if it's what they want. I'm going to say similar things about a separate policy, the child protection policy. Now, this child protection policy is a policy that is separate from the sexual misconduct policy. There was some confusion a few years back where the way the Book of Order worded it, you needed to have a sexual misconduct and child protection policy. I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but some people thought it could be one policy covering both. The General Assembly ruled it's really two policies. You could appropriately push back and say, well, these policies are very similar in a lot of ways. There's a few differences between them, but they're very similar. Certainly I would expect you would copy over much of your sexual misconduct policy into your child protection policy and vice versa, but there will be some differences. Again, so it is a separate document from the sexual misconduct policy. Again, in that same place on the Presbytery Cascades website, under Resources, under Documents and Forms, scroll down to find Clerk Accession information. You'll find a folder with examples that may work for your church. Insurance Board, Safe Church has resources. Why I didn't put the www. I think just Google Insurance Board or Church Insurance Board, and you'll find their website, and then look under Safe Church. You'll find some resources there for child protection policy. And finally, once again, your insurance carrier also may have good resources. They'd probably be happy to look over your policy and point out some things that may not be appropriate or may not provide robust enough protection. Insurance companies also have an interest in making sure you reference check folks. If that's part of your child protection policy, which it probably should be, they can often give you a discount on getting reference checks. So look into that as well. That is all I have for the Clerk of Session training. It looks like we have several folks watching, and several of you came in along the way. It's going to take a while for YouTube to whatever they do to it, but it will be posted as a link under webinars previously. I think if you check back tomorrow, it will be there if you want to watch the rest of it. I'd be curious in terms of some feedback. This is the first webinar I've done, actually the second one, but the first one I've felt like I've actually done the whole thing. And my curiosity is this helpful? I didn't really have a chance to have any give and take with folks, so I'm not sure how helpful. If I went too fast in some areas, was too long-winded in others, that'd be great to know. Well, thank you for watching if you're watching it live, and thank you for watching it if you're watching it at a later time. And look forward to later webinars for Clerks of Session. We'll do some more coverage this fall on the statistical reporting process, showing you some efficient ways to do that work. Well, thank you. All the best as you clerk and do the work of the clerk. And if you have any questions, never hesitate to call. I'm happy to help. Have a great day, great afternoon. God bless.